Emerging brands are chipping away at traditional organizations, and it's creating major challenges for chief marketing officers. One, the competition is expanding beyond anything we've ever seen before, and then two is these emerging brands are actually creating new consumer experiences that are elevating the expectations of the consumer and making it really hard for traditional organizations to really establish their brand in that manner. The good news is, though, traditional organizations actually have the ability to pivot and make a shift and grow and actually learn from these very startups that are disrupting them in their industry. So what can we learn from emerging brands with how it relates to our legacy processes, legacy systems, and legacy organizations, and what are the best practices for innovation for our larger, more traditional brands? I'm Paul Meiser. I'm CEO and co-founder of Chinatown Bureau. We're a digital product studio and consultancy focused on driving brand growth through technology. And to answer questions like these, we host a leadership series where we bring in thought leaders to come into the space and talk about their experiences and what their vision is for the future. Today we have Dave Knox, a close friend who is one of the few people who actually live and work in both the traditional organizations as well as startups. Dave is the author of Predicting the Turn. It's a great read for any CMO who's looking to learn from these startups and actually leverage startups and innovation for their own brands. So thanks for coming, Dave. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, it'd be great to tell a little bit about yourself before we jump in.
Of course, happy to. So my life, as Paul kind of mentions, I sit at this intersection between big companies and startups. That started when I was at Procter & Gamble. Ultimately, I was one of our founders of our corporate digital strategy team. And that was right in 2008 when the emergence of digital was happening. The iPhone had just come out, Twitter had just been launched at South by Southwest. Old people were able to get on Facebook finally, not just the college kids with .edu addresses. So it was really this great pivotal time. I then spent about 7 years as the chief marketing officer for Rockfish, which was a digital innovation agency that was ultimately acquired by WPP. But where my background's a little bit different is on the nights and weekends, I'm the co-founder of The Brandery, which is a startup accelerator that our graduates have raised north of $150 million in venture capital. And I'm not only a venture capitalist myself, an angel investor, but also an advisor to 3 different venture capital funds in San Francisco, Chicago, and Boston.
Very cool. Well, thanks for coming. I'm sure we're going to all learn a lot from your experience. So let's just jump right in. What is your brief synopsis of the business environment that's happening right now?
Yeah, I think it's the most exciting time to ever be in business and be a marketing or just business executive leader. One is there's a moment of change where it doesn't matter how big the company was, how established, how much market share they've had. That company's either at threat of being disrupted or they have to evolve to, kind of not go extinct. So if you're sitting in one of those seats, it's an amazing opportunity. If you're a startup or an upstart that's looking to go after that industry, the time is ripe to be able to do it. And finally, for those of us with our careers in that space, if you're a marketer, you have this chance to really expand your role. It's not just about marketing and advertising, but it's about brand growth. It's about this opportunity to help the P&L, to help the ownership, and to expand beyond of not just being in a world of maybe marketing and advertising, but go into sales, go into customer service, and really go into any touch point that will enable that brand to grow.
Right, yeah, that's great. It's been said that the CMO has the hardest job in business right now, especially in larger organizations, and you and I have both heard very senior people saying we have to act like a startup in these large organizations. So what is the role of the CMO today, and how has that changed over the last 5 years?
Yeah, it's the hardest job in the business is interesting. It's the CEO probably is the hardest job, but the CEO can really easily replace the CMO as an excuse for things not going well.
Right.
So it's definitely a unfortunately replaceable job at times when things aren't going well. So when you look at that role of that CMO, I think the opportunity that they have, kind of across the board is a CMO, if they've been doing their job right, they should be most in touch with their customers, their clients, their partners. And that external focus should enable them to bring in the knowledge to the company of where a business should go. One of the things I talk about in predicting the turn is this concept of market intelligence. And it's the ability to see the how and when the future of an industry is going to happen. And if a CMO is doing their job the right way, they should be that tip of the spear that is helping the rest of their peers see where that industry is going and elevate into that strategic position to figure it out.
That's great. Yeah. What is keeping the CMOs up at night right now?
You know, I think the CMOs, one is how do they go do that? Because it's great to talk about it, but how do you go execute it?
Right.
Because their traditional partners aren't going to be the ones that know how to do it. You know, the advertising agencies that they grew up with, those aren't the ones that necessarily can help them figure that out. So that's a part they have to do. Number two is how do they get the permission and the respect of their peers in the C-suite to enable them to do that? Because they might know it's right. But you know, today a CMO is spending almost as much on technology as the CTO and the CIO is.
Right.
So that in itself is a power struggle. Who should be in charge of those technology purchases? Because everyone in that C-suite's an accomplished executive.
Yeah.
So who gets the right?
Right.
Just because you say you want it doesn't mean you get it or deserve it.
Right.
So I think that's keeping them awake at night. And then the final thing, it's probably the most difficult, is you know, a CMO didn't get that job because they've been in the world of business for 5 years. You know, they have been accomplished and successful in getting to where they are. But today we're in this world of a new high stakes game of business. And that game of business today is not the game of business that they grew up in.
Right.
And so they have to simultaneously be leading their companies in this new direction, but also learning the new rules of the playground themselves. And that's, you know, the old analogy of building the plane while you're flying it.
Right.
That's in a way what they have to be doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely tough. And switching gears over to the emerging brand side, you mentioned that there's opportunities in service, there's customer support, all these places where emerging brands can jump in and actually start to make a difference in an industry.
Yep.
What biggest challenge do you think these emerging brands are posing for traditional organizations?
Yeah, so I think they're posing a challenge and they have a challenge themselves. So I'll start with the challenge that they have, which is one of differentiation. You know, the thing that creates their nimbleness and their way to go to market quickly and do everything else is also a disadvantage because anybody else can use those same tools.
Right.
You can go stand up a Shopify, you can go source the products. So that's a disadvantage that they have to figure out. Now, the disadvantage for the big companies against these emergent brands, and thus the advantage of the emergent, is they can be so in tune with consumer changing behaviors, and they can go and capitalize on those in maybe a way that a big brand might know is right, but they're not going to have time to be able to go off and do it.
Right.
Or they have to go get XYZ permissions, and by the time they take advantage of it, the moment has passed. You know, I think a great example of that right now is Dirty Lemon, you know, which is this really great new functional beverage in the water space, kind of indirectly. And they just launched recently one of their beverages with CBD oil that's added into it because of the trend, the legality coming around, and everything else. And I can guarantee you that somebody at PepsiCo and Coca-Cola and everybody else have talked about CBD as a functional part of a beverage.
Right.
But that is, you know, on 50 different attorneys needing to approve, are we okay with that? Then, you know, the CMO and the CEO saying, is that something we want to associate with our brand, on our equity? And it might be 2 years from now that they finally launch it. If that trend was on, Dirty Lemon will run away with the market by then.
Yeah.
And that nimbleness and that speed and the ability to say yes. You know, I was listening to a gentleman named Neil Grimmer give a talk, who's a founder of Habit and before that Plum Organics. And he said the greatest advantage of an entrepreneur is they have the ability to say yes.
Right.
The greatest disadvantage of an established brand is they need a lot of people to say
Right.
yes,
Yeah.
not a single person.
Yeah. And so the nimbleness almost sounds like that driving competitive advantage to get to market and get it. That's great. So innovation is a buzzword that we hear a lot in all boardrooms and all conversations and in traditional organizations. What are your views on innovation for more traditional organizations?
So I think the first thing to start with innovation is remembering it's not something new. You know, any company that's on the Fortune 500 today got there because they were innovative. And they were innovative not once, but over their history.
Right.
You know, if you look at the turnover of the S&P 500 and the Fortune 500, it's not new that turnover happens. And each of these companies, you know, what General Electric does today is not what they started off doing. They're not selling a lot of light bulbs these days. You know, Procter & Gamble started off selling candles. They don't sell a lot of candles today.
Right.
So they all built their business on innovation and that entrepreneurial thinking. The problem is that somehow over the last decade or two, they forgot those entrepreneurial roots. And so suddenly innovation is something new in these desperate times, but it's go back to what worked and why did you get where you are today, and reward once again a 5-year vision instead of quarter by quarter vision.
Right. Yeah. What do you see as the biggest challenge to work that way versus you know, innovation, rapid prototyping, and getting in the market now?
Yeah, I mean, the disadvantage is being a public company.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, a thing a lot of people don't want to admit.
Right.
But because that was usually the holy grail.
Yeah.
You build a company, you take it IPO, you ring the bell, and everyone's happy. But that focus on quarter by quarter earnings, the visibility of the marketplace, the rise of activist investors, and everything else that can drive that short-term thinking. A CEO of Fortune 500, you know, back even in the 80s and 90s, their reward was creating a clear vision of the mountain the company was going to tackle that was going to take them to new heights.
Right.
Today, it's about how do you get that in the next 3 months to hit the quarter.
Yeah.
That's a dangerous short-term thinking that creates short-term behavior that's putting those big companies at a disadvantage.
Right. Yeah. And so thinking of the emerging brand or startup world, how do you see innovation working there? Is it different than, you know, the pioneers of the traditional organization route, or how do you see that happening there?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the advantages of the emergent brands today is that they have access to research that can really be proprietary in a very different way. You know, because of it, I think the stat was in the 1970s, less than 1% of R&D spending and patents and everything else in the US was granted to a small or medium-sized business. Today, it's 25%.
Wow.
And it's because things like venture capital allow technologists to work for these early stage companies. You know, in the 60s and 70s, if you were a great scientist graduating with a PhD, you want to go to Xerox PARC or Bell Labs or one of these great homes of corporate innovation because that's where you could experiment and be a scientist and learn and see. Today, venture capital allows that same behavior to happen in the halls of startups.
Right.
And it's because, remember, a venture capital fund is measured by a 10-year return. So a VC by nature is long-term thinking.
Right.
If the struggle for a big company is they're forced to be short-term thinking, VC actually gives you an advantage in the long-term thinking.
Right.
And that's why, you know, it was, I think 2 years ago that Carnegie Mellon and Uber did a partnership around autonomous vehicle. 40 of the people at Carnegie Mellon, both professors and PhD students, ended up actually leaving Carnegie Mellon to go work directly for Uber.
Wow.
Because they knew they could do more experimentation and innovation there.
Wow. That's great. And you know, going back to partnerships, there's a lot of news out there of traditional companies testing partnerships with startups, even acquiring startups to gain that quick to market advantage. What do you think about you know, larger organizations working with startups or acquiring startups? How do you see that as playing in the mix of innovation and growth?
Yeah, I think it can be a core element of brand growth when done the right way and for the right reasons. So it all starts with the strategy of what you're looking to accomplish out of it. Are you buying market share? Are you trying to take a threat off the table? what's your goal with it, and what's the intent? One of the examples I love to cite is what Caterpillar did with their corporate venture capital unit when one of their first investments was this company called Yard Club. And what Yard Club allows you to do is it's peer-to-peer sharing of heavy machinery.
Oh, cool.
Not one of the things you'd first expect,
Yeah.
peer-to-peer. And when that investment happened, it was really easy to look and go, well, why would you want to allow somebody to rent a bulldozer to another contractor instead of that contractor, spending tens of thousands of dollars to buy one?
Right.
And the folks behind the deal, they kind of pushed on two things. They said, one is we don't know if peer-to-peer sharing is going to happen in our industry, but industry after industry pretended a trend wasn't going to impact it, and then it did, and then they were in trouble. So this is our chance by an investment to have an option on the table. We get to learn, we get to see, we get to experience, and then we can make an intelligent decision. Do we want to do something more in the space because of that?
Right.
But then the second part and the second reason was, just like automotive, heavy machinery doesn't make their money off of the selling of a vehicle.
Yeah.
They make it off the service of a vehicle. And if I can take the utilization of that heavy machinery and instead of being used once a week, it's used once a day or many times a day, well, that changes the direction and velocity of an industry, all through utilization.
Yeah.
So investment can be really, and partnership both, can be done in the right way that is much more than a short-term financial impact. It's got to be that strategic benefit that takes you a lot further.
That's great. Yeah. And so in those relationships and in those acquisitions or partnerships, what what lessons would you want to tell traditional companies versus what lessons at the emerging or startup world getting into those relationships?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that both sides need to have a conversation with is one, a conversation on culture, and what is the culture of each company, not just what you say publicly, but really what it is. To get to yes on a decision, who does need to be involved? How do we get them in the room?
Right.
Because a lot of times, these conversations will happen, and the startup's sitting there thinking that was a great meeting, we're going to get to a yes because of it. And the big company knew all along that they needed 3 other people in that room for that conversation in order to get to yes.
Right.
So talking that culture thing right up front is super important. The second thing that I think is really vital is a conversation on expectations. What is going to be the expectation of this relationship, this investment, so forth and so on, of where they might work together. Because I've seen instances where a corporate VC, for instance, and maybe less so a VC as much as a corporate unit, does an investment in a startup. And 9 months, 12 months later, that startup ends up selling and exiting. And they think the corporation should be ecstatic because they just got a 6x on their return.
Right.
Amazing, return to the company. And the big corporation is actually mad about the situation. And they're mad because that exit actually didn't matter to their balance sheet.
Right.
Turning 10 million into 50 or 60 million, it's actually a blip on most Fortune 500. What they wanted was the competitive advantage in relationship.
Right.
And if you'd had that conversation up front, it would have really solved a lot of different things. So, I think that that conversation on culture and then that conversation on expectations, no matter which of the avenues you do, that's where you need to start with.
Great. Yeah. Cool. So in all the things that have been happening in the last 5 years with acquisitions and partnerships, who do you think is kind of the gold standard of traditional organizations working with startups correctly?
Yeah, so I think it's evolving at the moment. So CB Insights actually just came out with this really interesting report that was looking at the behavior of the Fortune 500 and what they broke down of tech companies versus non-tech companies in the Fortune 500. And I think it was less than 20% of the Fortune 500 would be technically tech.
Right.
But those tech companies were 5 times more, did 5 times more acquisitions, investments, and partnerships than their non-tech counterparts. So we're in this world where the rich are getting richer
Right.
in a way. That the Amazons of the world are buying all these innovative companies, going into new directions, and maybe a traditional counterpart isn't responding.
Right.
Now, what's changing is I do think you're seeing that behavior be an inspiration. Look at Walmart's been pretty acquisitive.
Yep.
Target's started to get acquisitive with Shipt and a few others. So the behavior's shifting. But the most of the non-tech that are playing in this world, most of them are actually financial companies. They're doing it as purely financial investments. So I think Goldman Sachs, for instance, led that list.
Right.
Well, they're doing that as a financial
Right.
investment, not a competitive advantage necessarily. So some of the ones I do think are interesting, though. What Nordstrom's is doing is pretty intriguing with Trunk Club and some of their other plays of where they're getting into the space.
Right.
I personally love what Under Armour has done with buying the 3 fitness tracking companies. That a belief, at least externally, it looks like a belief that the future of athletics is going to be less about endorsements and more about personalization in yourself.
Right.
So I think that's pretty unique. And then I really like actually what Campbell Soup has done as a very odd one.
Right.
But while they bought new categories like Plum Organics, they've also invested into innovation. Now, they've done some of it very badly. Juicero was not a good investment by any means. It was intriguing, but that was a lesson of the due diligence that should be done, not just chasing the sexy name. But then they've also done companies like Habit, and Habit was actually the founder and CEO of Plum Organics. When his earnout was over, he was going to go launch a new business, and Campbell's decided to write the entire check for that.
Wow.
So they didn't lose the entrepreneur, they kept him.
Right.
And I think that's a really kind of compelling thing.
Yeah, that's great.
But we need to see a change. I mean, if at the very end of that CB Insights report, it showed the top 50 companies from ranking of their activity in the space, and there was only one single CPG company that was in the top 50.
Wow.
CPG makes up a whole lot more of the Fortune 500 than just that one.
Right.
So that was a pretty big flag that I think it was Coca-Cola was actually the only one that was on that list. No P&G, no Unilever, no Kimberly-Clark, no PepsiCo. So those are some pretty big names to be missing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it opens up a lot of opportunity for brands to think a little bit differently. So as we're kind of wrapping up, if there's one thing that folks can take away from this, if they're sitting at their desk in a more established organization, what would you want them to keep in mind as they kind of go about their day and looking to make a change themselves within their organization?
Yeah, so I think the number one change that needs to take place is we're shifting to a world of external innovation versus internal innovation. And what that requires is a different mindset. And that different mindset is about how do you engage with this ecosystem that isn't the one that you necessarily grew up with in your career. So how can you go off and do that? How can you go build those relationships? Particularly sitting in the seat that you are. You might be a brand manager or a CMO or a VP of marketing, and you've got a good budget, but what do you do with that? And where I'd encourage everyone to do is start with the relationships. The world of entrepreneurship and more broadly venture capital and innovation, it's actually a pretty tight-knit community. And it's a tight-knit community because of how funding works and the system and the process. And if you look at a typical VC firm, they have 50 to 60 investments. So a good relationship with one company can lead to a good relationship with dozens more beyond that. So start with building those relationships and start first with a, as Techstars calls it, a give first mindset. How can you pay it forward? How can you show a willingness not to take from the ecosystem, but to give to the ecosystem first? Go off and do that. But by doing that, don't do startup tourism. Don't think that doing a trip out to San Francisco and seeing Silicon Valley and visiting the Facebook and Google campuses means you've done that. Start engaging in a real way and start in your backyard. There is a real kind of groundswell right now of the rise of the rest. And while Silicon Valley has been the historical home of innovation, that innovation is happening in Los Angeles and New York and Cincinnati and Chicago and Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Get out there and engage with your communities and figure out how to support it and learn the playground that way. So that's where I tell everyone to start. Find those authentic ways, get involved, build the relationships, because those relationships are going to pay dividends for decades to come if you do it right.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, Dave, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. And for everyone at home, thanks for tuning in. And for Dave Knox, I'm Paul Meiser, and we're happy to help you build tomorrow today.
Thank you. Have a great one.